Enjoy.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. Welcome to everybody, wherever you are. I'm sorry that we're not gathered in Vienna again. It's become a regular appointment for me in the autumn to come up to date with the freshest management ideas. As it happens, this session, rather appropriately, was always aimed to be a remote session about remote working and remote leadership. And so I'm very happy to be able to gather from all parts of the globe an excellent panel to discuss the question, is remote leadership an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms, making the future of work work? With me are Donna Flynn, VP of Global Talent at Steelcase, Ben-Ishai, Head of Economic Policy Research at Google, Tammy Erickson, Leadership Advisor and one of our top-ranked management thinkers and a Drucker regular, and Ashok Krish, Global Head at TCS for Digital Workplace. Before I turn to them for their opening remarks, I just want to point out that, as Yvonne's already suggested, this is going to be, I hope, a highly interactive session. And we would really like you to be submitting questions from the outset, directed either at specific panel members or indeed at the whole panel. And I will try and work these into the discussion as we progress through the 90 minutes. We're going to break, as we've been doing in other sessions for the forum, to send you to a breakout room for some more intimate discussion of some of the issues that are raised after our initial conversation. And then we'll return and take your questions for the rest of the discussion. So I'd like to launch into this perhaps with a slightly tongue-in-cheek poll for you. If we can put the poll up and just start you off with this. I've seen a lot of sessions, in fact I chaired some where we've asked people what they miss about the office or what they relish about remote working. This one puts it the other way around. What do you not miss about your office or workplace? Do you not miss seeing your boss in person? Do you not miss seeing your colleagues in person? Do you not miss networking in person, which we would all be doing in Vienna, were we there? Do you not miss the office at all? And if you could choose one of those, and we'll use that just to freshen up the discussion as we start it. So go ahead and make your vote now. I will just give you a few seconds. I know that it's taking a while for people to sometimes to hit the, you can only choose one. I see people saying I miss all of those things. Afraid you have to choose one that you don't miss. So let's just see whether the results are in. Glad to hear that you miss all those things. There are some virtues to the office work which we will discuss. But go ahead and vote, and let's have a look at the results. So it's not seeing the boss, which is the outright winner here. Some people saying they don't miss the office at all. That's a strong vote, but that fits very nicely with the discussion that we're about to start, which is obviously about remote leadership. I'd like also just to encourage you, and we'll keep an eye on this as well as we go through, to post in the chat what you consider to be the most challenging aspects of either leading remotely or working remotely. And we'll try and pick up some of those in our discussion as well. But first of all, let me ask our expert panelists to get us started. I'm going to start with Donna. Donna, I know you've been managing remote teams for a while, but perhaps you could answer the question in the title. Is it a contradiction in terms to lead remotely? Donna, over to you.
Well, obviously, I don't think that's a contradiction at all. I think many leaders have been leading distributed teams globally and regionally for many years in companies of all sizes. However, this year with the pandemic, what we've seen is a forced tipping point to what is an extreme state of remote work and remote leadership. So I have been leading globally distributed teams for about 10 years now. And I have learned that it is different than leading teams who you see every day in the office. There's a different set of demands and a different set of skills. And I think it is harder in some ways. I think these are skills that will be more and more in demand in the future. And I think there's three things I would highlight. One is being intentional about being clear with your team and connecting with your team, because you don't have the opportunity to run into them and have serendipitous encounters. And so intentionality is really important. Secondly, I think you need what I think of as a third eye for EQ, or emotional intelligence. You need to be able to build trust remotely, and you need to be able to see into the emotional landscape of a team and know when to dive in and know what's working. And then thirdly, I think more than ever, remote leaders need to help their teams manage their energy, both collectively and individually. I think well-being is a top-line requirement for leaders to be thinking about, especially today, as we are all experiencing video fatigue and the lack of connection and just the constant extended hours for globally distributed teams. So helping their teams manage energy in different ways is a different kind of demand for remote leadership. So those are some of my learnings over the last 10 years.
Thanks, Donna. Already very valuable. Perhaps you can answer a question that's already come in on the chat, or a suggestion that from Warren, who says that the biggest challenge he's experienced being remote is leading large group or team discussions, i.e. 12 to 50 people. Do you have any advice about how you handle that at Steelcase?
Yeah, I think large group discussions tend to not be as interactive, for sure, but you can always follow them up with smaller group discussions, or even precede them with small group discussions.
So, sorry, you're breaking up. You're just breaking up a little bit, Donna, there. No, Donna, I'm afraid you're breaking up a little bit. We got the first part of it, that you think splitting up into small groups.
Yes.
And we'll come back to you for the discussion. Let me pass on to Guy from Google. Guy, this question, remote leadership, something that I think Google has been doing for a while. I think you're way out in the Pacific somewhere, so you're probably used to being physically remote. But what do you feel is is there any contradiction here? What are the things that get lost in remote leadership?
Yeah, I can't. I am in the Pacific, and it is 3 a.m. my time, so I think I probably will win the award for the most distant participant on this session. But as to your question, Andrew, so just to take a slightly different approach from Donna, absolutely. I think that by definition, leadership is about being present, and it's about presence. And if you're not present, by definition, and it may be just a semantic one, you cannot really lead. Now, I'm not trying to kind of like catch tongue in cheek, but I think that it does reflect this notion that there is something intangible about the distance, the inability to interact with your colleagues and with your peers in a more personal way that makes leadership more difficult. I think that there is something to it, at least in abstract, that makes the distance and the remoteness difficult aspect of leadership. But with that in mind, and I think that, Andrew, the question that you asked is probably was not in the abstract, but rather the context is the current situation that we're in today, with the global pandemic, the deep economic crisis that we're in, and with rapid digitalization. I think that if you think about the number of dimensions of uncertainty and risk that organizations are facing, I think that is really the definition of what's required of leadership. to manage such risks. And I think because it is so important to lead during these times, these trying times, I also think that the distance or the remoteness takes a secondary nature. So in that respect, once I'm kind of like falling back into the context, which is what's going on today, I actually do agree with Donna. I think that there is no contradiction. I think it's virtually just a reality.
There's a comment come in from Michael on the chat saying that he finds there's a difference between leading distributed teams of people located in other offices versus leading teams of people that are completely remote, where they're working from home, as many of us have been under lockdowns of various sorts, or on site at clients. And he says it's important to make sure nobody's on an island by themselves. You are on an island by yourself, I think, Guy. But I mean, what's your experience of this difference? Because obviously people gathered in offices are working closely with each other face to face. That is slightly different from reaching everybody in their front room, wherever they might be, or in their home office, or indeed, as Michael says, on site with a client.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that Michael has a very important point, and I think that I think we all seek the human interaction, and I think that the frequency of interactions, and I think that the number of people that you interact with is actually really important. And in that respect, I do agree that there's a lot of challenges when it comes to kind of like absolute remote work, in which that aspect of interaction is just missing. It makes it more difficult to lead in many different respects.
Right. Tammy, perhaps you'd like to pick up the thread here in any way you see worth pursuing. I mean, the overarching question, we seem to be reaching the conclusion that it's not an oxymoron, remote leadership, but clearly there are difficulties. Where do you see this, and how do you relate this to the current unpleasantness, as it were?
Well, I'll give it a little bit of an oxymoron, I guess, or at least say there certainly are situations in which it could be. You know, to me, leadership is really expressed in the way that you focus your time and your attention. And what I've found from looking at leaders over time is that the most successful ones are really good at picking out the activity for their organization that should have their major time and attention. And that changes over time, and it changes with business. So back 100 years ago, or even maybe 30 years ago, the primary kinds of things we were competing on had to do with being efficient, making things at scale, those kinds of questions. And the activities that leaders needed to worry about were standardization, conformity to standard, and so on. Now, to lead that activity, you have to be able to see people, or at least monitor people in some way. And so I can understand that if you're coming from that perspective, it would seem like an oxymoron. Somebody asked a question in the chat about accountability. Well, accountability, if what you're accounting for is conformity to a process standard, is more easily judged if you can see the person. However, I personally believe that the vast majority of the activities that will make your company stand out today are not ones that have anything to do with conformity to a standard. They're activities about thinking. They're activities about digging deep and tapping your discretionary effort. And that requires creating the kind of environment where people want to do that. And that, I think, is something that does not require physical presence. I don't think leaders at all have to be physically present to create that sense of passion and excitement. And so if you plan to compete based on innovation and sensing trends and so forth, you can create a fantastic environment without ever being physically present.
There's quite a lot of discussion coming up in the chat about this issue of trust, but also about, you know, how do you convey emotion in remote leadership? I mean, clearly you're suggesting, and you're conveying it yourself right now, that it is possible remotely via video or otherwise to get the passion into a team. Any sort of tips on that? I mean, what's the kind of key?
You know, okay, here's a tip. Be corny. I don't know if that word translates around the world, but I worked with one organization that had a slogan around being true blue. And all the leaders got on Zoom with their faces painted blue. Okay, that sounds stupid if I just say it like that. But honestly, it created such a shock, such a excitement among people. Oh my gosh, here are our, very serious senior leaders with their faces painted blue, that it brought that sense of identity and passion together. So I think you have to think very carefully. And what I'll talk about as we talk about specific suggestions is the things you need to do aren't intellectually complicated, but they require spending time and thinking about how can I do it. So think about how could I create passion for people.
Right. Nice one. And I think, there's obviously a strand running through a lot of the discussions here, as there always is actually at Drucker, of the sort of human side of leadership. And lots of people I've spoken to over the last 6 months have talked about how they, as leaders, were able to, literally see into people's rooms, see the hinterland of what their team were working on, and also having to reveal things about their own life at home or life beyond the office that they might not have thought of revealing before, which I think is all positive, provided we can keep that.
It is more human. You may hear dogs barking any minute now.
Ashok, over to you. I mean, you're obviously working with TCS both on the ideas about the future of work and with clients, and indeed with your own team about what the future of work and remote working looks like. What have you drawn from this discussion so far?
So it's been a very fascinating last 6 months, given that we're an organization with 500,000 employees, right? And the fact that we actually help other organizations enable remote work. So it's been a really ringside, courtside view into what's been happening here. So a couple of things that we've kind of observed, right? One is the fact that there are clearly certain kinds of things that people love about working remotely, at least in our context. Developers love it because, most of the work that they do is about individual productivity, and that works really well. I think what's interesting is that I, as I say, a leader, typically in most global organizations, senior leaders almost always by definition are working remotely. I mean, they may be sitting in an office, but their head of North America business, the head of UK, the head of Europe is by definition going to be remote. So a lot of your core leadership team is almost going to be globally distributed. So senior leadership was never the challenge in this context at all. I think the single biggest thing we learned is about the kind of people who operate teams physically in person, who rely on kind of walking over to people, asking them doubts, and that kind of ambient awareness. That's what's missing in this kind of challenge. So what we need to do is to figure out how to create ambient awareness virtually. It's not quite the same thing. I mean, some great ideas in terms of virtual coffee breaks that I can see in the chat room, or painting yourself blue, having these sort of non-work related discussions. We used to have fun with putting internet memes in our virtual backgrounds and so on. So there is all of that. But what is actually quite interesting is changing the nature of what I call mid-management or junior level management roles. Really, we need to train people in what I really think is in new rituals, right? So I think when you're in a workplace, a lot of the rituals of work that you learn are very implicit. You don't quite, it's not written down anywhere. You kind of know how to manage a team, you know how to run a meeting, so give everyone a chance. You kind of know how to get everyone's opinions. You kind of know how to spot issues and proactively help and so on. Nothing, you don't need to be taught this. It comes naturally. But I think we need new rituals for virtual work. You don't know what's going on, what kind of stresses people are going through. You don't know the fact that they have to deal with 2 kids and pets and other things. So I think it's people need to be taught new rituals, and I think it's part of that whole remote leadership is, in my opinion, ritual design on the edges, right? A lot of this has to do with more federated decision making, right? So rather than centralized decision making, let people make their own decisions rather than have a half an hour Zoom meeting. There's just going to be Zoom fatigue, right? So in one of our we found out that some teams, some managers were setting up 32 hours of meetings for their direct reports in a week. that's not productive at all. That leaves about 8 to 9 hours of time, of free time, if you will, right? So it's just that you have to use a lot of this data and really just nudge a lot of these rituals into sort of your junior leadership. That I think is your single biggest takeaway from the point of view of building these new practices, if you will, of remote leadership, at least at scale.
Are there some specific rituals, Ashok, that you found have worked well at TCS with your teams?
Yeah, so one is create templates for certain kinds of meetings. So by default, the problem is you set up a meeting, it's half an hour or 1 hour, right? No, so sort of create templates that say this is a status meeting. So in fact, there are certain categories of meetings where we say, why not just simply have a shared spreadsheet in the chat or on your Slack that everyone can see? So don't have to update yourself on status. But instead, the default time for a meeting is 15 minutes and various kinds of, there are 10-minute stand-up templates and so on. And create all these kinds of group integrations that allow for a lot of information to be naturally visible to everyone. So one of the rituals is called working out loud, which is essentially ask people to really consciously keep talking about what they're working, how are they doing, and in some sense, what problems are they facing in ways they would otherwise not, right? In a physical workplace, where people know when you're having trouble and you'll kind of look over, people will come and help you and so on. You don't have that. So working out loud is one ritual. Meeting templates is another ritual. Virtual coffee breaks with these kind of fun, memes is another ritual. And when I say ritual, in some sense, we actually told supervisors that, look, you are not connecting with your direct reports at least once a week, one-on-one. I mean, you're all part of meetings, but are you actually chatting with that person one-on-one? We found that teams where direct supervisors actually chatted one-on-one with as much of their direct reports as much as possible, right? Video or in either case, one-on-one, did better than teams where they did not, right? And only relied on these big group meetings and so on. So I think we'll have to invent a way of staying connected. And I think that's really what this is about.
And just briefly, those one-on-one discussions, they don't have to be very long, do they? I mean, it's a question of sort of frequency more than length. Exactly. See, we all have Zoom fatigue. The last thing we want is more meetings on our calendar. It's just, in fact, we encourage people to not set up meetings because that feels like work, right? Just ping someone and say, hey, hi, how are you doing? Just wanted to kind of catch up. How are you? How's your kids? And so on. And surprisingly, again, we're a company with a ton of engineers. We sometimes have to tell people, you need to ping people and say, ask them about their family. We literally have to tell people that, act human in a way that they're not used to. And in a sense, it's not surprising. A lot of technocrats end up sort of not having to do this because, teams end up doing this naturally in a physical workplace, right? So you have trouble, you gather for coffee and the people around you, you're not going to naturally talk about other things. As a boss, you now have to literally start to do all of these things. Right. There's some great thoughts coming in, I can see on the group chat. I do hope somebody's going to, in the interest of asynchronous working, which is another thing we may come to, I hope somebody's going to cut and paste all the insights that are coming in from people and they're sharing on chat so that we can all see them later. Let me come back to Donna on this question of rituals, though, and what you set up. What's worked for you at Steelcase in terms of kind of finding ways in which I've found, for example, as a relatively new all-in remote worker, that the virtual coffee chats and all those sorts of fun stuff that was set up in the first month or so, eventually people went, shrug, I better get on with my work. Nobody's at my virtual coffee any longer. And they've kind of withered away. Donna, what are the rituals that have worked at Steelcase?
Yeah, I would echo what Ashok said about connecting one-on-one with people and going deeper in your organization, not just with your direct reports, having frequent touch points across the team. I think also, to build on what Tammy said, it's important for us to show vulnerability in this situation of crisis management. About a month ago, I shared a story with my 200-person global organization about the days I've had that were really difficult during the crisis, where I woke up and felt helpless. And it's just stories like that and how we get through those and overcome them, I think, are also very powerful. I think another key ritual to reframe here is the famed 10 minutes at the beginning of a meeting. That's the lost productivity. Those 10 minutes when you're connecting and working out your technology and having social interaction are actually really, really important, even more so now than ever, to have that informal connection, to have people share stories, to let that human side come out on teams. So my teams in the past have done different ways to approach that social informal connection. It doesn't always have to be a coffee chat. Another thing we've done is have little text messaging buddies and share pictures from our homes or daily lives, and really just giving a peek into the other parts of our life outside the video lens. So those are a few things.
Just to pick up on a question from Slido, I mean, and I'm sure you've had this experience, and then I'll come back to Tammy and Guy. The question, Donna, is, from experience of gathering a new team together remotely is a big challenge. Do you have concrete advice for forming a new team remotely as a leader? This is a question that's come up a lot with people I've spoken to in the last few months. Donna? Yeah,
and I've just been through that because I took on this role in April after the lockdown, and I took on a new role of 200 people globally. And what I did was I designed a virtual listening tour, and I met with every single team around the globe and kept it really about, here's who I am, here's my purpose and my values, and now I want to meet you and hear about you. And so starting on that ground, that very human ground of establishing relationships, sharing stories, and I was able to fly around the world much more quickly virtually than I could have in a non-COVID world. So that was very useful.
Right. Tammy, let me come back to you. I mean, a lot of the things that we're hearing are things that, really we should all be doing anyway, aren't they? I mean, I think in some ways we've talked a lot in other forums about the acceleration of technology and the way in which people have suddenly been able to digitize everything. But there are some core leadership skills here that people are applying that really they should have been doing 5, 10, 20 years ago.
Well, you're probably right. I mean, again, I try to be very flexible about what you should have been doing 20 years ago, because I don't know what your objectives were 20 years ago. I would say most of us come out of a tradition that says efficiency is what we're trying to gather. And so we think a great leader is someone who starts a meeting right on time and jumps right into the agenda items. And so we have such a bias around efficiency and productivity and so forth that we aren't thinking about our role as one that is about creating this environment of discretionary effort. I think that a leader's role today has 4 key parts. You need to disrupt, in other words, give people time to absorb new ideas. You need to intrigue them by asking them the kinds of questions they want to think about. You need to connect them. That's all this social connection we're talking about. And you have to engage them through this sense of identity and purpose. And if you think that your role is that, rather than productivity, conformity, etc., then giving time to those things starts to make a lot of sense. So the kinds of things we're talking about here, I think, become essential for leaders. I mean, I chaired a meeting just the other day where I caught myself because I normally would have started the meeting by saying, okay, meeting is called to order, first item on the agenda. And instead, I kind of, disciplined myself to spend the first 10 minutes going, how are you, Mary? How are things with you? How are you, Joe? And sharing back and forth among it. And it totally changed the atmosphere of the meeting. So as leaders, we have to recognize that our role is no longer driving efficiency, it's creating environments. And one of the ways we create them is by providing time and facilitating these kinds of human interactions.
Right. The another sort of point from the chat. This was a question specifically for you, Tammy. I mean, how does remote work happen across the various generations? I mean, I guess like remote work between the same generation, but do you have any kind of particular thoughts on that?
Well, I don't actually think it's a significant issue. I think there's a lot of stereotypes that maybe older people would be less comfortable on technology, et cetera. Most of the older people that I know are busy having virtual wine tastings and, sharing recipes and talking about books and so forth. So, it doesn't have anything to do with age. I think the same kinds of challenges that we would face in person are still there about understanding perspectives and being open and excited about somebody who thinks about the world differently. But again, making that distinction is the leader's role. Open it up so it's okay to have different opinions.
Right. Guy, let me come back to you, either on any reflections you've had on what you've heard so far, or specifically on this question about the sort of rituals or ways in which you make remote work work for people who perhaps aren't used to it so much.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it is Tammy and Donna were mentioning the frequency of meetings. I actually reflected on my own experience. I have actually joined Google a week before the pandemic broke out, and it was quite a challenge to, it's a large organization, and in my role, I interact with a large number of people. So what I found personally, what helped me tremendously was kind of like insist on taking the time and having periodic check-ins. To Ashok's point, both with people within my team as well as people across the organization. It is time-consuming. It does take. I think it has to be managed with a balance. But I do think that, from my own experience, I think it's been very helpful in, at least from the very beginning, in a situation where you come into a large organization, to kind of like insist or have the discipline of meeting with individuals on a periodic basis, even if it does consume a lot of time. So I think that was kind of like one takeaway that I thought that was really important, particularly given the environment of remote working.
Right. Let me turn this on its head a little bit. We're pointing to some of the advantages of remote working and ways in which it can be made to work. But there's a question, an observation really coming in here on Slido that, won't turning your home into an office lead to more stress and loneliness? And is work from anywhere really a desirable scenario post-pandemic? Clearly, we're in lots of parts of the world we're still in this, and we may well be in this for a while. But are we going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as we say, that to give away the advantages of the social part of work by grasping too quickly for the remote part? I mean, Guy, perhaps you first, and then I'll come back to Ashok on this.
Yeah, I think that's such an excellent question, and it's one that I think there's so many uncertainties about the crisis, and I think that like reverse urbanization and whether the workspace environment would remain the way that it was prior to the crisis. I think it's really difficult to unlearn things that we're comfortable with. And I think that the problem is that there isn't a clear consensus as to individuals that collectively like working from home as opposed to individuals that miss the office environment. And from internal surveys that we have taken, that surfaces pretty consistently, that some people really enjoy the new situation and they would be hard pressed to unlearn it. I myself, for example, in that initial survey that you had, I actually found myself saying that I do not want to go back to the office because as much as I appreciate the in-person interaction, for me, spending the time with my family and spending the time that I otherwise would have on commute is invaluable. But to that point, I think it's a really difficult and challenging issue. A year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years to now, what are we going to do when we have this kind of like divergence where part of our workforce population is eager to get back to the work environment, where other is eager to stay home and maintain the situation that we're in now?
Right. Let me go quickly to Tammy and then to Ashok. Sorry, Tammy, you want to come in on this?
I'll just be very quick. I think you've really put your finger on it, but I also think we're talking about the wrong end of the question. To me, the question is, the work we do today requires people to behave like adults. It requires us to treat people like adults. And I don't think companies should ever, I'll say that broadly, in the future, worry about the question of whether people come into the office or not. Just tell them to get their work done. Ask them to get their work done. And if they want to come into the office, fine. If they don't, fine. These are the kinds of, as somebody said, schoolhouse issues. You know, what time do you have to be in? That the company shouldn't have to worry about. We're adults.
Right. Ashok, to you, I mean, obviously there has been work done before the pandemic, the work done out of Stanford on what the best optimal setup is, and it is the one that Tammy suggests, where people get to make a choice about when to work.
Exactly. I think she's, I mean, she hit the nail on the head. I mean, it should have always been, it should be outcome driven, not whether you're at the office and spending 9 hours driven, right? A couple of points that I wanted to mention. One is that, so clearly what is important is that we are kind of assuming that there's a certain history to why we work the way we do and why offices are the way they are. It's really just goes back to the Industrial Revolution and really just the dawn of the 20th century, that we started having this idea that there's a big office in the middle of town, and then you would commute from the suburbs, right, long distances to come, work there and then head back, right? And many of these decisions are not natural at all. A combination of economic, policy, political decisions that over time, we've now begun to assume that somehow that's the natural way of doing things. It's not necessarily, it's not sustainable for starters, right? The real goal, to Tammy's point, so the real goal here is that people need their space and their ability to do what I call continuous partial attention in the way they are comfortable, right? So, we used to call it attention deficit, but we call it continuous partial attention. So you're always context switching. Some people context switch faster than some people context switch, in different ways. But it's really about figuring out what works for a team in a given context, right? There are things that you need to do individually. You do that from your home, you do that at your own pace, and you do it in a way that you get the outcomes done, right? And there are situations clearly when you need to meet, when you need to brainstorm, when you need to whiteboard. These are all, no matter how great the tools are, virtual whiteboarding simply doesn't work, right? So you still need to meet in person. That doesn't have to involve a 50-minute commute to a giant office 2 hours from the city. So in some sense, a lot of this also has to do with the fact that there's an opportunity to think about this really differently going forward, right? So that's what I wanted to mention here.
Donna, you wanted to step in here.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything. I think at Steelcase, we have been talking about a principle called choice and control for years. People do their best work when they have choice and control over where to do the work based on what they need to do and who they need to do it with. And for years, we've all had an ecosystem of places that we can choose from. We have an ecosystem within the office. We have an ecosystem outside the office. Work from home is now a normalized node in that ecosystem. It's one additional node in that ecosystem. The office, I think, will become even more important as a space for building culture, for building connection, and for hosting high-value collaboration, innovation, and collective creativity. There's going to be some people who will choose to go to the office every day, and there's going to be some people who choose to go to the office for very specific activities. And I think as leaders, we need to be very conscious about designing our teams for these cadences of presence, when to be together, absolutely, when to build trust, when to have that collective creativity, and really building the conditions for collective innovation and creativity to achieve those outcomes. And the office will continue to be a key host of that, but it's not going to be the only host, and it hasn't been the only host for a number of years.
Right. So, I mean, I've written a little bit about, and I've seen others talking about the idea that perhaps there are some new roles needed here, and perhaps this is a way of repurposing some of the junior managers that Ashok mentioned in his opening remarks, the ability of people to be able to facilitate the links between those who prefer the office perhaps, or need to go to the office because their home setup is not sufficient for them, and those who actually prefer and would like to stay with remote working but don't want to feel that they're left out in some way. Tammy, I mean, back to you. I mean, do we need some facilitating of this? I mean, it's right to offer people the choice, quite clearly, as you've said, but some people do need the encouragement to not become so remote that they're completely detached and then fall into loneliness and other things. And others perhaps need some encouragement to bear in mind that there are people out there remotely while they're all getting together and having fun in the office. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, a couple thoughts on that, kind of going in two directions. One is I'm a huge fan of informal network mapping, however you do it. And of course, technology today makes it so easy to understand who's that person who's isolated out there in the hinterland somewhere. And as leaders, I think we have to be aware of what the informal network maps are in our organization and at least coach those. I wouldn't necessarily force them, but to say to people, who do you think you need to have a relationship with in order to do your job effectively? And how can I help you form that personal relationship? Give people the skills to help them develop the relationships they need. And so helping to facilitate the formation and liveliness of that informal network is important. The other thing I've got to put a plug in for, and there's been a couple of comments, I guess they've scrolled up, I can't see who made them. Andre, I want to say was someone who said something about what if you have people who basically aren't adults, can't behave themselves. Well,
do those people exist, Tammy? I mean, we're all adults here, aren't we? Nobody's going to behave badly in the office or out.
Well, what I would say, what I personally believe is that over time, we will increasingly pay for outcomes. And the more you begin to reward people, not based on tenure or anything of that sort, but you begin to say, this person produced 4 things of great value and you pay based on that, then you almost give up caring whether they're adults. I mean, in a sense, if somebody only wants to do 1, you only pay them for 1. If somebody does 10, you pay them for 10. And so it becomes, again, you're treating them like an adult because you're essentially saying, how much work do you want to do? And you're recognizing that those who really get into it are going to, in fact, reap better financial rewards.
But may I just push back on that a second? Because that seems to me to be potentially, I agree that we move away from presenteeism. We start to reward people on outcomes and output rather than saying, just because you're here with your jacket on the back of the chair, we're going to pay you. But if you could reduce that at a particularly inhuman organization to essentially just ticking boxes and saying, this is what we need to be achieved by this person, and it could be anyone, anywhere in the world. How do you avoid that happening, that actually we all become the sort of sum of our output rather than any of the sort of connecting things, human things that you've all mentioned? Yeah,
it's a great pushback. And so how you balance that with that sense of identity of being part of the organization, it's something I personally don't worry much about because I spent a lot of my career as a consultant. And I can tell you, coming into some organizations, I felt an instant bond. I loved them. We were bonded. I had as much emotional, passionate energy in that organization's success as any other. And so I know you can come in to organizations and connect and have that. Even if you're not a full-time employee. That's what I'm trying to say. I don't think the employment label gives you some magical identity with the organization. I've had it many times as essentially a contractor. But it's an important issue and one that we as societies have to take into account. The reality is we don't yet have the social safety nets in place that we need to have in society to support the future of work.
Right. Guy, can I ask you on this point that's come up, the C word, culture, has been raised a few times. And I think there are issues potentially about building culture remotely and how you hold it together, particularly to some of the points that Tammy and I have just discussed. As you've got people who are increasingly taken on the basis of individual tasks that they might complete. Is there, without a hub, a center, is there a risk here that corporate culture begins to dissipate or disintegrate?
Absolutely. I think it's not just a question of not having a hub. I think it's also an issue of size and scale. And I think it's what I'm stating is banal to some extent, but it is true. Small organizations are easier to maintain a culture. Large organizations are very difficult to maintain one. And I think what you see is also an evolution of different competing hubs sometimes, and sometimes it's a natural evolution when you expand geographies. If you walk into a Google office in APAC, you may feel a little bit different than if you would walk to a Google office in South America. And I think that's a reflection of the local culture as well, and that's inevitable as well. Having said that, I think that, and this is my own impression, working at an environment, at a place where there has been so much deliberate effort with tremendous resources that are invested towards maintaining a unique culture is valuable. I think that it is felt by the employees, it's felt by everybody at the firm. And I feel like at any size, if you lose your culture, you start losing your identity, to use Tammy's language. And I think that's really important.
Right. Donna, let me come back to you on that culture issue, because obviously you've built a culture at Steelcase by working mainly remotely in your own case.
Yeah, and I'm actually an anthropologist by training, so culture is close to my heart. And I define culture in companies simply as the shared values and shared behaviors. And so it really takes us back to the beginning of the conversation, where we talked about passion and connection and aligning on shared purpose. And I would guess, Tammy, that some of those companies that you walked into as a consultant, you had shared values and shared goals and shared purpose, which brought a sense of meaning. So that's a key thing for leaders to think about building remotely and reinforcing at all times, is those shared values. And then there's the shared behaviors. And that brings us back to the conversation about rituals, new kinds of rituals that need to work remotely, or as we go back to the office, that need to be inclusive of those who are present in the same room as well as those who are remote, because we're all going to be in constantly distributed meetings from here on out into the future, with people in the room and people remote. So thinking about those shared behaviors, I think that's another key place where the office will continue to be a key location for building culture, because space shapes behavior. And we know that from the very earliest archaeologists ever in anthropology. We look at material culture. And I'm in the business of building material culture to shape behavior for people to do the best work they can. So I really do believe that we need to pay attention to that more and more in the future, and how we want to design, again, these conditions to reinforce these values and behaviors.
Frank on Slido has asked, and I'll stick with you on this, Donna, that to what extent you can use walk and talk in outside environments to sort of share and reflect on ideas with other people. I've actually found that suddenly had a revelation halfway through lockdown, when we were allowed to go out for an hour a day or whatever, that I could actually call somebody while I was on that walk outside. I didn't have to do everything on screen or while sitting doing my back in at my desk. But Donna, is that something that you use either virtually or in person when you're managing people?
Yeah, definitely. I've started actually breaking away from the screen, because the video can seem somewhat confining. And what we say, it makes us feel tethered to one spot. Whereas in an office, you're not tethered to one spot. You get to move around. So remotely create your own activity. At Steelcase, we've done a lot of research on well-being at work, and there's different dimensions to that, and definitely movement, vitality, physical movement. We encourage walking meetings, getting up and moving around, doing meditation or yoga, all kinds of ways to get your body and your brain moving. So I think that kind of takes me back to my earlier point about managing energy on a team. As leaders, we need to manage our own energy. Yesterday, I started at 5 a.m. and ended at 10:30. And I had to plan my day around that, to make sure I could manage my own energy. But you also need to manage the energy of your teams and be able to tune into when someone might really need your validation that they need to take a break or do things differently.
Okay, I'm going to suggest that we take a break from this particular group at this point and send our audience out and some of the panelists out into breakout rooms, and then we'll return. It'll give me a chance to have a look at some of the chat that's been coming in the meantime, and perhaps pick up some of the questions when we return. So I'll hand over to Yvonne to explain how this is going to work. Yvonne, over to you.
Thank you. Andrew, just one more question. Is there a specific question you want to give to the participants that they can discuss or should worry about within the next 10 minutes?
I mean, I'm happy for it to be freestyle, but there's a lot of interest, I think, in what sort of rituals and techniques people are using to maintain this. And I think perhaps to push this to the future of work, we've touched on this, but clearly what we're going to have is a sort of a hybrid workplace. We're going to have leaders some of whom want to be in the office, managing people who are outside the office, and vice versa, as Guy was suggesting. So I think it'll be interesting for people.
That was quick. Andrew, can you hear me? Can you bring Andrew back? for all of you, but now all Zoom participants and all live stream users should be here with us. And we can continue maybe with some insights or whatever. Andrew.
All right, fine. Well, I mean, I'd like to, having got everybody excited to be visible, I'm reluctant to ask people to turn off their videos, but we'll keep going with the questions and insights. So please do keep filling the chat box and Slido. And perhaps I go back to the panel, because some of you have been in the Zoom rooms discussing some of these things. As I mentioned when we were offline, I think one of the things I'd like to try and address in the last 20 minutes or so of the discussion is, what happens in the sort of hybrid world? How do we get to a point where we're actually balancing when people have the option of coming in or staying away, what are the sort of leadership skills that are required for keeping those two groups happy? I see Donna there. Donna, was there anything discussed in your room that you would like to relate?
Yeah, we had a great discussion. We had a very full room of 3 people, including me. So we had a nice discussion about the importance of transparency. And we talked about that in a couple of different ways. Transparency on teams, using agile approaches like stand-up meetings and regular touch points and collaboration tools to make information available, to share current state, to have regular touch points and updates. I think that helps create this ambient environment that Ashok referred to earlier, so that everyone feels like they know what's going on the team. And then we also talked about that on a leadership level. One thing that we've tried to do at Steelcase through the crisis is be very transparent about all the decisions we're making throughout the crisis. And sometimes we have to make those very quickly, but we share what the decision is, and then we share the why behind the decision. And that has been really, really greatly valued by all our employees, and has built a strong sense of camaraderie and purpose and trust. I think the tension there that we also talked about is that how do you choose what to share and when? Because that is still a challenge as leaders that we need to manage. And so there is this tension about being transparent and as a way to build the team, but also being careful about how you are transparent and when.
Yeah, there was a question earlier for you, Donna, on the chat or on Slido about I think you mentioned showing vulnerability as a leader, and somebody wanted to pry into what vulnerabilities you had displayed to your team, if there's one that you can share.
Yeah, well, the one I mentioned earlier was sharing with my team kind of my own personal challenges emotionally throughout the crisis. That, usually when I'm in front of my team, I have the passion, I have the purpose that Tammy was referring to, but I actually shared a story about these are the days I woke up crying, and here's why, and here's how I felt about that. And I had more people reach out to me across the world after being very honest with my own difficulties through the crisis than ever before.
I'm kind of interested whether that would have been more difficult if you'd been doing it in a room full of team members than via virtual meetings.
Not for me. It's always easier for me to connect with people face-to-face, one-on-one. I think there is this staged element on video. You always feel a little bit like you're acting in the stage. And so it was difficult for me to do. And it was hard. It didn't feel as authentic to me as it would have in the room, but it did to them. So I was happy for that.
Right. Guy, if you're there, let me go back to you. Just on this question that's been raised on the chat just now on, we talk a lot about digital tools. Clearly, Google's at the heart of a lot of the digital tools that we've been using, people have been using, and it's accelerated while we've been in various forms of lockdown or protecting ourselves from the pandemic. But what about the non-digital? I mean, I'm interested actually how much discussion goes on at Google about the non-digital, non-technological side of leadership and working in a distributed fashion. Guy, if you're there.
Yeah. Hello, Andrew. Let me just point out that it's kind of like funny that coming from the tech world and a digital platform, I'm faced with like a non-digital aspect of leadership. This actually came up in our conversation, which was very lively and productive as well. And I want to actually circle back to that as well. One aspect that was really interesting about non-digital aspects of remote work was the fact that, broadly speaking, as we consistently find out internally, Googlers really like the offices that we're in. And one of the drawbacks from the working remotely is actually this kind of like recognition that now the space and the environment that we've created that is so much appreciated by individuals who work at Google is no longer available if we're working remotely. So that's kind of like one of the non-digital aspects, I think, of working remotely. But Andrew, if I could for a minute, kind of like follow up on the point that Donna had just mentioned, because I think that was really important about the hybrid model, which we discussed in the breakaway group. So just for a couple minutes, we didn't come up with a solution of what to do next when you have two different populations within the firm. One that wishes to remain at home and one that wishes to come back to the office. But I think we found some characteristics that could be really helpful in kind of like understanding what the issue is. And Tammy mentioned before that we should never force anybody to do something that is against their individual preferences. Now, I think we should think about that framework in two situations. In one of them, let's assume that there are no synergies, that this is really just based on individual preferences. Some individuals would like to come back to the workspace, and perhaps there's going to be some equilibrium, some gravitation. As more people enjoy the benefit of having company in the office, perhaps more people will do so, but out of their own volition. That's not a problem. The problem arises when there are actually synergies, where there are some technical or professional issues that are just better hashed out in a physical room where there's 12 people around the boardroom. That is where the problem rises. And the question is, what do you do in that situation? Do you induce people to come back, or do you not apply any rules at all? Because in that situation, there is an issue of miscoordination. And I think that's the real challenge here. What do you do in situations where there are synergies that require an entire group to be present for those synergies to be exploited?
Yes, we've had an issue as a newspaper, as a media organization. Clearly, for somebody like me who writes a column and features, I can work remotely, although I miss having spontaneous interactions with colleagues. But a newsroom covering breaking news relies on a lot of the unspoken or sometimes just kind of side comments that go on as a story is evolving into how things get done. And I think there has been some added friction, and we've discussed various ways of getting around that by having open squawk boxes, if you like, where people can talk to each other freely without having to contact them directly. I think there are ways in which exactly what you're describing has been an impediment to doing some of the news coverage and news discussion that we've been doing. Tammy, let me bring you back in. Did you join your breakout room? Was there anything specific that emerged there that you'd like to raise here, or any of the other points you'd like to pick up on?
I did join my breakout room. First, I want to just say to Guy, and I think Frankie's already said it for me in the comments, if you've got an adult should be able to figure that out. So the problem you're worrying about, I would say, is not the leader's problem. If you've got people who are too dumb to figure out that they can do better work by collaborating with others, then you got people who are too dumb, and you need to educate them or get rid of them. So I don't think leaders have to, dictate what work needs to be done together and what work needs to be done individually. I can figure that out. I'm smart enough to figure that out myself. So that's my comment on that one. Now, in our group, we actually had a great conversation. We were starting about introverts and how important it is as leaders that we pay attention again to this, who's isolated, and help them, that we facilitate them coming in. We also got into a discussion about a point that I made quickly, and I guess so quickly that it generated a bit of controversy about this paying for outcomes. What I'm trying to say there is that a lot of the work we do today, it really doesn't matter the hours it took. If you ask two people to write an article for the newspaper, Andrew, there's one's good and one's bad. I don't care if it took you 5 minutes to write your great column, and I don't care if it took somebody else 5 days to write a crummy column. I'm interested in the good column. And so, how much time you spend needs to be your choice. Again, I don't need to manage you in terms of hours. I need to manage you in terms of whether you wrote a good column. That's all I care about. So I'm not saying it's going to be an immediate switch to this kind of what feels like very mercenary way of doing it, but it's about recognizing that time is less of an issue than quality.
Right. Let me just pick up perhaps with Ashok now on the point about people who are in the chat. One comment from Andre is, I've had the impression, he says, that remote work is easy when you have responsible, accountable and hardworking people. What if the majority of people aren't like this? Isn't this, and I'm interpreting here, isn't this why we have management? Ashok, what happens when you've got people who perhaps aren't as accountable and hardworking? The old, largely myth, but not wholly myth, of people just saying, well, I'm going to slack it. I'm working at home. Nobody need know. Turn off my camera and do whatever I want to do. Do outcomes solve that, Ashok?
So it's interesting. So on the one hand, so given that we have like 500,000 employees, not all work can always be measured by outcomes. In fact, by definition, we have some roles of people who are in essence paid for their time. So it's very, very, it's specific to how the nature of their work and so on. So it's not that easy. To the question on slackers, they've always existed. People who want to slack will slack even in the physical workplace. They'll find ways, they'll find a corner, window sort of seat, and they'll find ways to, slack. I think that problem has always existed. If anything, if you actually tell me, in virtual teams, in fact, now we can use a combination of data from collaboration systems and so on to at least identify potential people who are completely disconnected. It's very hard to do that in the physical workplace, right? Now I actually have data. If I know somebody has never joined a meeting, has never chatted with someone, I have some data. It may not necessarily indicate that they're slacking, but at least I can tell the manager, maybe you might want to, pick that person and talk to him, right? So in a sense, I think, we're now in a better place. The panel discussion we had was actually quite fascinating, is related to this, is this idea we left off in the whole question of culture, right? And the fact that we sometimes lose good elements of corporate culture when you work remotely. I think the point that we kind of did not discuss, and we continued that in the breakout, was that not all culture is good culture. Not all corporate culture is good culture. There are often unrecognized elements of bad corporate culture, right? And so it's important to recognize that when you suddenly go remote, you're worried about people not carrying the good culture, but you should also be worried about people carrying some of the bad culture, right? To take a very simple example, you might have a culture that values, helping society, having a purpose and being empowered, but you could also have a culture of micromanagement, culture where people don't make financial decisions without going 3 levels above for approvals. And if you carry that to remote work, it's just inefficient. You're going to increase the cost of coordination. Remember, remote work is high cost of coordination. Right? So you want to specifically pick and invent new elements of culture that help you reduce cost of coordination and throw away those bad habits that you otherwise did in the physical office and so on. And the second interesting element of this was the fact that by definition, the physical office actually restricts your ability to have a diverse workplace, right? You're geographically, people have to travel. You have to spend time in the office. It automatically removes opportunities for people who are not from large cities. It removes opportunities for women, women with children and so on, and minorities and so on. But I think the real elephant in the room in terms of understanding diversity in the workplace now is the ability to support different styles of working, which goes to everyone's point about saying that people and teams have to figure out, based on the kind of employees and the team members they have, do I have 100%, I am happy to be remote, then your leadership style has to be different. If you are a team that really likes to be completely together, or maybe it's a mix, your leadership style has to be different. If anything, I think culture has an opportunity to continuously evolve faster. This old adage of letting 1,000 flowers bloom is going to be a lot more true for this hybrid virtual organization than it ever was, because culture is much harder to change in a physical workplace than it is to really continuously experiment as we go forward.
Right. I mean, Kenneth Mickelson in the chat has made this point as well, that the office is just one place where meaning and values and so on are evolved in the work. And so his question is, let's work out how online or offline gatherings are different and how they complement each other. And that's, I guess, something that in most workplaces we are only beginning to see, because we've now got more.
We're just scratching the surface. We have so in fact, my global unit, I've also invested in a bunch of anthropologists who are part of my behavior sciences team, whose job it is digital anthropologists, whose job it is to look at collaboration data and figure out interesting patterns. What are collaboration anti-patterns and what are sort of good patterns, right? And it's still too early to kind of figure out what are the right ways of doing it. But I think we'll have a ton of interesting insights that come out to challenge a lot of the standard assumptions about what is productive work and so on.
Right. Donna, you were mentioning your anthropological background. Is that coming to the fore now much more even than it was before in terms of interpreting what works and what doesn't work for the hybrid workplace?
Well, I've been leading a team on the future of work for the last 9 years, so it's been pretty top of mind. But I do think the point that you're making, Ashok, about how online is different than offline is really important, and that as leaders we all need to become more savvy about when is the right time to be online, when is the right time to be offline. This kind of circles back to what Guy was saying. When do you know? How do you make people come together? As leading a globally distributed team for 9 years, I've held in-person workshops twice a year for that team, for everyone to come together for 3 days. And my 3 design principles for those workshops are: we need to build something together. We need to have lots of social time, and we need to learn something together. And then the teams themselves, everyone, every time we have a couple team members design that workshop, and they're very experiential, and we learn together, we build together, and we have lots of informal time. As humans, we are biological beings, and our brains are wired to connect with people and to be social and to be physically together. And so we're not going to completely walk away from that with remote work. The question is, when is the right time to bring that in? How frequently does your team need that to do the work they need to do? And how do we create the conditions for that?
Right. Tammy, any thoughts here about how one gets to this nirvana, if you like, of having hybrid work where we understand what works online, what works off, when in the office, there's some suggestions I've seen in the chat that perhaps this is a role where leaders ought to be directing people a bit. I've fallen into this thing of worrying that in order to have a spontaneous meeting with my colleagues face to face, I have to arrange it, get permission, make sure we all turn up at the right time. That's management, isn't it?
Well, I think the kind of things that Ashok is doing in terms of studying what really works. I guess I would say rather than leaders having to manage it, I would say we all need to learn about it. These are learnable skills, and Ashok and his organization are going to give us some great insights into when we should be doing what and how's the best way to do it. Let's think about it as learning, not managing. And I think that's how I'd approach it. I do say the one thing I would add to the conversation about, letting people make choices is I do believe in asking groups to talk about what will be the best for this particular type of work. And that, bring it in that way, so that if you have people who would prefer to work out in the woods somewhere and never talk to anybody, if they can at least see that for this particular piece of work, it would be better to work together. I think facilitating the conversation is really important, but let them come to that. Let them be an adult.
Yes, that's a very good point. Guys, that's something that you apply at Google. Clearly we're saying everyone should get the choice, but you also want to raise the question, as Tammy's very well said there, that perhaps there are types of work, maybe you want to think of a way in which you can do this best, and it might not be having everybody out in the sticks on screen.
So we do tend to hire adults, but there are some situations where there are some coordination issues that sometimes just require access to physical infrastructure, computing power that requires certain individuals to be in the office. And then the question arises, what do you do with the rest? So to Tammy's point, I think you're absolutely right. To the extent that those situations do not arise, I think that one should try and avoid and force a solution on individuals. I think that's very clear. I think the challenge really is when those situations do not exist and for some other reason, there's a need for people to come into the office, and then what do you do? I think that's the challenge.
Right. Ashok, just to flip back to you again, this question that Tammy's raised, it's a very useful question, I think, to be able to put to people when they do have the choice. Do you use it at TCS?
So this is so in the context of TCS, you know, one interesting thing we've kind of observed is that the more you listen to Tammy's point about learning, right? The more leaders are exposed to interesting things that other junior level leaders are doing. Sometimes the only problem is that only lessons of senior leadership kind of become common knowledge, right? So every company wants to do knowledge management. It just doesn't work. But in this world that we live in particularly, I'll give you a great example. One of the smaller teams within TCS started this practice where they felt now that we have to hire virtually, right? So we have to therefore interview people virtually, right? Historically, that person would come to the office and you would have this conversation, right? Interview and so on. They did this experiment where they said that the technical interview, the interview where you just look at the person's technology ability, would be conducted without video by design, right? We have the capability, but we will switch off video because we do believe that it will reduce biases. The first initial bias, you know, if you don't pass the technical interview, you don't get to the next interviews and so on. Yes, you'll do the video interview at some point of time, but the first couple of interviews, you don't do video, right? And it's really telling us that it's actually tremendously improved reduction of biases and in our ability to hire different groups of different kinds of people and so on. So this is the kind of small micro innovations, if you will, on the edge, leadership innovations on the edge. This is not a HR strategy. It's not a HR policy. This needs to now sort of percolate through. So in a completely thousand flowers bloom sort of manner, so that other people kind of learn and they experiment with it and they tweak it a little bit and so on. So this is just one of the examples that I wanted to share.
Right. We're running out of time. In fact, we are out of time. I did think briefly that possibly being empowered remotely would allow me to run over time and immediately kind of extend this fascinating session for another half hour. But even without Richard Straub in the front row tapping his watch, I recognize that we have to end on deadline. So I just want to thank Tammy, Guy, Donna and Ashok for their insights. We've left a lot of questions unanswered, so there's a huge appetite for more on this topic, and I'm sure that people have taken away some useful insights, tips, and I hope optimism for the future, which is not on us yet, but is accelerating rapidly towards us, and the ability of remote leaders to take us into this future in a humane and sensible way is definitely enhanced by some of the things we've heard today. Somebody asked me whether, like my colleague Lucy Kellaway, I would miss the office and whether I cherished the office. I do miss it. And so I hope we get back to some form of hybrid work, properly led, that will allow us to make the most of both experiences and indeed the many more that we've had in the last 6 months. I'm going to hand back to Yvonne now as our host. Thank you, Yvonne, and thank you again to the panel. Yvonne, back to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you all to our discussion panelists. It was a very lively conversation. I thank you for all the questions and all the answers that we got. I would like to invite you for the next half an hour to our network session in order to get in touch to maybe discuss in a deeper way. And at 4 o'clock at this live stream, we are going to start with reimagining what it means to lead. And I'm very much looking forward to see you there. Bye-bye.